Welcome to another expert podcast run by UNESCO's Inclusive Policy Lab. This is part of our expert series focusing on a post-COVID reset, meaning, of course, from our perspective, a reset along a more equitable and smart path. As usually in this series of podcasts, the conversation will revolve, on the one hand, around concrete policy measures that our invited experts see as being conducive to such a recovery, and on the other hand, on the data and the knowledge that we have, or maybe that we need, that could or that should inform the required policy shifts. Our expert today is Arianna Legovini of the World Bank, where she founded and leads the Development Impact Evaluation, DIME, group. Her expertise is in improving the generation and use of research in development practice and policy. Arianna works to understand and develop the institutions, the incentives, the processes required to generate actionable research. And all of these issues are, of course, critical to the conversation we'll be having today. Arianna, welcome, and thank you for accepting our invitation.
Thank you, John and Julia, for having me. Thank you very much.
My name is John Crowley, UNESCO's Chief of Research Policy and Foresight. And as often in this podcast series, I will be your host today. And co-hosting with me is my colleague Iulia Sevciuc, UNESCO's lead on inclusive policies and knowledge use in policy, who coordinates the work of the Inclusive Policy Lab. This podcast falls under our work stream on data for good. We'll be looking into new data, current data landscapes, and the use of data as a tool in and for governance. And running through this discussion, as always, will be the post-COVID recovery and the place of data in it. And with that in mind, what I'd like to start with is the question of data in connection with governance. In other words, data as an instrument, a tool, both in and for informed governance and decision-making. We've had some very interesting discussions in other podcasts, which I encourage you to listen to if you haven't already, on how the private sector has seen massive investment in data culture and in the capacity to engage critically and absorb data in corporate decision-making. So with that in mind, but obviously focusing on the discussion between representatives of international organizations this time, where do the public sector and policymaking relevant to the public sector stand? How, Arianna, would you assess the progress being made in the public sector to transition from old-style data landscapes reigned in by statistics in the very old 18th century sense of the word, ultimately, to a much more complex and faster evolving context of new data? Or to put it very crudely, what's 21st century data in the public sector, in your view?
Wow. Okay, that's an important question, and it is work in progress. Building the institutions for actionable evidence, what I would call evidence to inform decisions, it's a long process of building capacities in governments. And it has less to do with the type of data that is available and more with creating the capabilities to understand the value that data can add and the pathway through which we can push policy action. I think in the case of government, new data, especially high-frequency transaction-level data, has or adds some drip. In part, I think it's because visualizations of shiny data points attract our attention. They're watched, downloaded, shared like never before. But more importantly, high-frequency transaction-level data holds the promise for minute-by-minute flows of information that can inform decisions just in time. So you asked me about assessment, and I think realistically, evidence is only informing a tiny portion of the policy decisions being made every day. For most of our history, data has been scarce and quite expensive to obtain. And so research has advanced, especially in the public sector, at a slow pace, and especially so in data-poor countries. But with the explosion of data from smartphones, mobile networks, e-services, and e-government, we can now envision a world where more and more decisions can be guided, informed, and evaluated by just-in-time research and evidence. So the private sector you mentioned is quite kind of a leader in this, especially large corporations from social media and others who are using research and evidence on really on a 24/7 basis, and a lot of experimentation with their client base to maximize profits or maximize viewership, etc. I think the potential in the public sector is there, but the process has been quite more arduous to affect. Now, the upside, though, of using it in the public sector and for public policy is to significantly shift the path of human progress. So it is quite exciting. The opportunities are huge. There are also dangers. I feel that poor analysis, lack of understanding of inherent biases in the data we use, poor understanding of comparative statics versus general equilibrium effects, lack of understanding of correlation versus causality, et cetera, can lead us to the wrong conclusions and wrong guidance. So the scarcity I feel that we now face is one of limited high-quality research skills and institutional capabilities to help us make sense of all the data and turn it into a positive resource for human progress.
Thank you. And we have much to come back on in what you were saying. I'd like actually to make an almost immediate follow-up, which I think is very connected to what you were saying, in terms of the barriers embedded in traditional statistical institutions and procedures with respect to the kind of vision you were presenting of real-time data to inform policies. One is that in the statistical tradition, there's been a strong emphasis on clean, rigorous, technically well-designed data, and the data collected for a specific purpose. Whereas one of the challenges, which you've already referred to, is that much of the data that is currently available and perhaps not sufficiently used is first dirty data. It's very noisy. It requires a lot of work to make it usable. And secondly, it's data that was not collected for a particular purpose. It needs to be repurposed or repackaged in order to be made useful for a particular purpose. This makes it richer, but it creates challenges to the way in which public statistics have traditionally been organized. And then the second big issue, perhaps even the elephant in the room, is privacy and data protection rules, which often impede the use of data from these kinds of sources, and indeed often impede even the sharing of operational data from public institutions across barriers. In many countries, for instance, I think this example came up in a previous podcast in this series, social security administrations and tax administrations are forbidden from sharing data for reasons that are connected to perceptions of privacy and individual freedom. And while in the case of personal data, that is probably very defensible, in the case of anonymized patent-level data, it's probably very inefficient. So I'd just be interested in your views on those two types of barriers, the spirit of statistics and the data protection issues, and how they impede public sector data use and how they could be overcome while respecting the very real concerns about data protection issues.
So I would start by saying that it is very rare for data to be ready for use, irrespective of whether it was collected for a purpose or whether it's collected as part of the transformation in technology. I find that the research is a great organizing principle to create data sets and data systems that can be applied to answering specific policy questions or specific research questions that are policy relevant. And for that, there's actually a lot of work that needs to go into what I would call measurement framework, understanding what do we need to measure for what purpose, and how can we measure what we measure most efficiently. So in the past, this was quite an expensive process because almost everything was based on face-to-face surveys in the field and kind of stretching our capacities to build measurement framework as we would have liked to build them. Today, the latitude of what we can go after is so large and exciting. And so, in our best examples, for example, in Rwanda, building a national data system to look at the impact of rural infrastructure on economic transformation, we have merged data from firm and household surveys and censuses. We have merged administrative data from tax and land registries. We have gone out and collected primary data on 63 different commodities in 150 markets to understand in real time changes in prices and quantities. We have merged that with data from GPS, from trucks, delivery trucks, and so forth and so on. And not everything has to be very costly. We can combine very detailed data from statistical agencies with data that comes, almost automatically from those GPS trackers, and really increase the understanding and the dynamic understanding of geographical space. So when the government rehabilitates a rural road, we can tell almost in real time how that affects arbitrage opportunity between nearby markets and kind of shifting produce, increasing the returns to farmers and increasing the availability of food and averting food crises in some markets. So this becomes a quite exciting operation that we were never able to do before. So I don't really focus on why the data is collected, but rather how we work with the different data sources. What are the most efficient ways of collecting quality data? And we do a lot of work comparing across different ways of collecting the same information and understand whether there are biases in those different ways and how do we address those biases. Because of course that's one important element in having good research that results in actionable, precise and actionable guidance. It is almost an ethical issue to deal with data in a responsible way so that the analysis results in answers that are actionable but will lead to better results as opposed to harming the very people that we want to help. On the issue of security, so this is something that we have kind of really blew up in our face during COVID. And specifically in March 2020, we started a task force on mobility. The idea was to leverage some of the research that we had done previously in using CDR data from telecom companies to understand the transmission of other disease, such as malaria and cholera. And we used CDR data to understand how mobility and migration of people contributed to transmission of disease. And we wanted to use these models and type of data to provide dashboards to governments to monitor mobility across their geographical space. And here we faced huge issues of accessibility of telecom data, exactly because of the security issues that you pointed to, John. Of course, we don't want to use data to track people or specific type of people of specific ethnicities and have people empowered to track us down. These are huge issues. And so we developed, security measures that included only having access, for example, to average movements, not specific movements of individuals. And we worked on protocols for securing data and so forth and so on, but the difficulties in accessing the data became quite binding in our ability to kind of scale up across all the countries in the world these tools and capabilities for governments to manage mobility issues in a more effective way. Now, the security issues were actually the World Bank just approved its new data security policy, and my group has been working together with others in the bank to develop all the guidelines on data security. So these are very, very similar, I think, to the security guidelines that have been implemented in the past by the EU. So everybody's becoming quite more aware of the need to and the responsibilities that we have communally to use data in a responsible fashion. At the same time, as you said, John, we want to balance the value added that the data can provide to the betterment of human conditions and making sure that we use that data in a very responsible way as not to harm the very people that we are trying to serve.
Thank you. Iulia, I think you want to come in on this with a follow-up question precisely on what governments need to be doing as a priority.
Yes, so we talked about the capacity of the public sector, of governments to use and engage with the new data. And you, Arianna, mentioned several things, the pace of data production, the volume and the noise in that data, and the risk of not making sense of it properly. And that not making sense properly would skew the decision making and the policy making. My understanding, I'm listening to you and I'm thinking that it's a very deep shift that is needed on the side of the government and the public sector. What do you think they should be prioritizing in terms of steps and critical areas to invest in and focus in these fast stages of the shift and of the change?
So I've invested my whole career on the issue of how to increase capacities in governments to make more systematic use of data and evidence for the purpose of improving the results and the effectiveness of public interventions. I would say that my main answer is co-production. The co-production of evidence between research and practice is actually fundamental. First, because research skills are very scarce, and we need to focus them on the question that potentially can make transformative difference on the results. And so practice must help inform and shape the objective of the research. And second, because without putting the evidence into action, the value added of the research is lost. Thus, we need our own research capacity to help build capacities and shape practitioners' capacities to put evidence into action, really supporting the building of institutions and capacities over time. Now, it so happens that this takes a lot of time. There are no short-term solutions to building capacities in governments for the systematic use of data and evidence. In research, also making faster progress towards bridging the knowledge gaps, which are huge, requires a different model of research, kind of moving from the micro-entrepreneurial, which is most common, to a more corporate approach to building knowledge. At DIME, for example, we have invested in a different research production function and associated workflows to really capitalize on our scale and specialize in the delivery of research. We have invested in thematic programs, in country research programs that are able to leverage both kind of the economies of scale and scope and generate, public good nature tools that we are making available to everyone in the research community. But I think more needs to happen from the research side, less competition and greater collaboration. This is one of the lessons I think we have learned from COVID, which is that once we have an objective really clear, when there is financing and the need to collaborate across many research centers around the world, we can find solutions very quickly. Financing is a big constraint and collaboration is a large constraint from the research side. In public administration, I would say that there is so much more that we can do. People generally, working in government agencies, particularly in low capacity environments, can be quite hard on public officials. They often lack the resources, the agency, the autonomy to take decisions that make a difference. And so I find that we can provide a lot of excitement in these discussions by empowering public officials to set the agenda, to be active participants in the process of what I would call adaptive and iterative research that provides them with the training, the tools, the information, the understanding on how to affect change and kind of see the light at the end of that tunnel. I find public officials respond very positively to the excitement that we ourselves feel that we can make a large and significant difference in results. And so we focus on training and learning by doing, investing tools, dashboards. Mostly we invest in accompanying the whole process of design and implementation of policies. So this is, I think, one shortcoming of development agencies, that they focus a lot on design and financing, but very little on accompanying process while they happen. And so kind of helping programs and policies on the ground experiment, finding for themselves. So really a focus on local knowledge and how that local knowledge can inform their decisions in real time. Gets everybody excited and motivated to invest more. So I don't think I've answered really your question in terms of what, all the things that need to happen in government, but I would say that kind of motivating and increasing the understanding of what data and research can help people do in increasing results and documenting their own successes, negotiating their own budgets, and so forth and so on, can be quite powerful to move that ship in the right direction.
Thank you. You did reply to my question, and you took it a bit farther in the sense of saying that it's not only new data the government should be focusing on and developing their new capacity in, but it's also a matter of integrating different forms of knowledge, such as research or statistical data, new data, and making sense of those as a coherent whole and using all of those for policymaking.
Having discussed in quite general terms issues to do with data and governance, I'd like to move now in the second part of our discussion to questions more specifically about the COVID-19 pandemic. The extent to which the pandemic has, if it has, changed the world of data, and perhaps more importantly, the realization on the part of ordinary citizens, policymakers, analysts, of the power of data and its possible uses and perhaps also misuses in collective decision-making. Perhaps never has there been so much discussion about quantitative indicators in the context of often very polemical and complicated discussions about difficult policy choices. So, given the pace at which decisions had to be made in the face of the pandemic, given the need for real-time data to inform those decisions, do you think COVID has changed the game with respect to the policy data connection? Has it perhaps done something to expose the kinds of capacity gaps we were talking about earlier, and perhaps convince people who might have been skeptical that there's now a need to invest much more in real-time reactive data that is much more comprehensive than the slow, deliberate pace of statistical investigation? How much difference has COVID really made?
I think COVID greatly increased awareness among policymakers on the dearth of information they face to act on the crisis. And so demand for real-time analysis surged quite substantially across all of our client base and stimulated a lot more work from our side as well. But I would say that, it is very easy to be interested during crisis, and it is much harder to sustain efforts once crisis ease out. My permanent argument to everyone who wants to hear is let's invest today, because things will happen in the future and you'll have the same questions and you don't want to be unprepared. So I would like to give you a couple of examples actually of investments that we made before the crisis and how they were used during the crisis. How much more readiness allowed us to be very forthcoming with support to governments when and exactly when they needed it. In Rwanda, we've been working for 10 years with many different agencies in government to kind of build on their already very good administrative systems and complement them with a greater amount of information. That is really our best case scenario for being able to provide daily information to government on the effect of the crisis, the effect of the urban lockdowns on the rural economy, being able to look across price changes across many different commodities and really target those farmers or those sectors that were adversely affected. But I want to give you an example from Nairobi, which is I think a little different. So back in 2015, I met someone called John Macharia. He was the founder and head of a company who that insured matatus or informal minibuses in public transit in Kenya. And we discussed issues of road safety, and he made available to me all the data that he had on road crashes. And since then, he actually died himself in a car crash more recently, which was a travesty. But since then, we worked to build a system, a data system for managing the urban space. So almost no progress has been made on the Sustainable Development Goal to cut mortality on the roads by half around the world. And this is the number one cause of untimely death of our youth. So the question we posed in that context was, is it possible to use data to target and prioritize investments on an urban landscape where those investments matter most? And so we digitized 7 years of police records on car crashes. Literally, we went through all the police stations in Nairobi and collected all the paper reports and created a digital data on those crashes. But then we realized that the data was not sufficient, and we started, developing algorithms to geolocate and timestamp Twitter reports by bystanders across the city. We then hired a delivery company to guarantee the crashes in real time. We overlaid data with Uber data, weather data, Google data, created the first real-time crash map of Nairobi. So, and then we went out and collected survey data and video analytics to understand both the infrastructure issues in hotspots as well as behaviors of people on the road. So I'm going a little bit in details in this just to say that one of the results of this work was that we found out that only 1% of the road network represents more than 50% of the deaths occurring in the city. And the 71% of those deaths are pedestrians, what I call the walking poor, because they don't have enough money to actually use the public transport system. And they die on the road in about 150 kilometers out of the possible 4,500. And by investing in that less than 1% of the road network, we could actually save so many lives that die unnecessarily and untimely. And through saving those lives, we can actually save those families from sure financial hardship and disaster. Now, this was developed before the crisis. clearly. But during the pandemic, we were able to use that system to provide real-time information to government about the effect of lockdowns, the effect that those lockdowns had on mobility, but also on speed on the roads due to lower traffic levels, and the increase and spike in crashes and mortality around the time of the curfews, as people were speeding to get home on time before they would be stopped by the police. And so kind of, and the same system and the same algorithms can be used to geolocate and timestamp other types of events in the cities, like crime or mudslides or other environmentally caused disasters around the city, help the city develop ways to both predict, plan, and manage crises in real time.
Thanks for those examples, which are really very telling. What this points to is a kind of three-way connection at a minimum, which is a data ecosystem that involves both multiple, not necessarily coordinated sources of data. Secondly, the capacity to crunch that data, including in experimental ways that are looking for patterns without necessarily having a hypothesis about what patterns there might be. And then, of course, the sensitivity of policymakers, which might include corporate policymakers as well as public policymakers, to actually pay attention to what emerges from the data, even if it clashes with people's prima facie understandings of how things work. And as we know, this is at the heart of the social sciences, of course, and we know this very well in our UNESCO work. Overcoming the barriers of common sense is often one of the big challenges to using the outcome of data-driven approaches. If something clashes with what you think must be right, then you will tend to ignore it and find reasons to dismiss it. And that is obviously a barrier to be overcome. So I think Iulia wants to go a bit further in this regard.
Yes, so we are talking about all of these examples, and they are fascinating. But in many cases, these are sporadic uses of data. And in crisis, indeed, many governments had access to the new data and really used it extensively to inform their decision making. But beyond the crisis, given the complex ownership of data and stewardship of new data, and much of it lies really with the private sector. Beyond the crisis, do you think the governments will have systematic and systemic access to this new data? Can they rely on this data for policy making in the longer run, not just in times of crisis?
I think it's quite realistic. But it does take time and effort. I mean, this is not going to happen just by accident. So I'd say first, investments in e-government, as I mentioned earlier, in the last few decades is generating a huge amount of largely untapped data. This is, these sources continue generating larger and larger amount of data, and the interest from these agencies, as we see it, has increased a lot. And so these are uses of data that are not one time, but it is a process of learning how to use their own data for the purpose of identifying more and more way of doing better. And it is a long process. The research agendas have just started in many of these areas. I mentioned working with justices. I mentioned working with procurement data, electronic billing for tax data. All of these areas are very important. Now, you mentioned the private sector data. And here we overlay really public sector with private sector data. It is proprietary in many cases, it is true, but a lot of it is publicly available and can be scraped directly from the web. In the case of road safety in Nairobi, we scraped 250,000 tweets from the web. to for a period of 8 years to geolocate and timestamp road crashes. In the case of even in case of government data, we scraped 80 million records from the web in the case of the Indian justice system across all court levels. Now, it required quite a bit of effort. I'm not dismissing the effort, but it is possible to gain access to a lot of data. And the second point I want to make about private sector companies is that we have found a huge increase in interest in those companies in making a difference in development. And so we are working with telecom companies, social media giants. We are working with huge commerce platforms and transport companies all over the world to use their data and put it to good use.
Listening to you, I was thinking that we made a full circle. You're saying that there is a lot of data generated on the public sector through the e-governance, and if there is need for more data, there are many different sources and possibilities of getting it from the private sector. The challenge is not getting data. From what I hear you saying, the challenge is making sense of it.
Yes, I would agree with that. Definitely.
So following from that, and given the need to create data systems that actually support understanding as well as action, what, in your view, are the key areas that researchers in various areas of research, and perhaps you might want to differentiate economists, sociologists, or whatever, need to dig deeper into? What are the key knowledge gaps on data and data systems at the moment that could be answered perhaps by the kinds of initiatives that international organizations can promote?
My own opinion is that we spend too much time focused on kind of general statistics and indicators, and too little time on really using research and policy relevant research question as the organizing principle to both develop the data systems to answer those policy relevant questions and to increase the motivation and awareness for having those data systems in the first place and sustaining them over time. Increasing appreciation of data, I think it's step number one to get things moving in the right direction. And we have pushed governments to collect data for a long time, but without giving them a reason to do so. And the resulting data quality was very low, and rightly so, so to speak, because nobody was using it for any good purposes. Why put so much energy into it? The main constraint that I would like to point to is financing. There is still very little understanding, not from the private sector. I think they're fairly clear that that is the way to maximize their profits, but from the kind of development institutions and public sector, there is very little understanding that research is not additional cost, but that research pays for itself. I want to give you some examples of that. We worked in Ghana on a project to increase tree planting. And we worked to introduce financial incentives, which triplicated adoption or participation in that program. And then we worked to optimize those incentives. By optimizing those incentives, we were able to double the number of communities being serviced by this project without increasing the cost, and increasing effectiveness, total effectiveness of 70% over the baseline. We only spent about $500,000 to increase the size of that program by a factor of 2, and increasing the effectiveness of that program by a factor of 70%. In the case of Côte d'Ivoire, we ran a heterogeneous impact analysis across the participants to a Cash for Work program. Very vulnerable populations, all deserving of being included in a social protection program. However, what we found is that women were able to extract twice as much value from that program. And that by retargeting that program more heavily towards women, the effectiveness of that program could be increased by 70%. Again, this is another example where the research was a tiny amount of that program's cost. And by using research, we were able to increase the effectiveness by huge margins. I have so many examples of this across all of our work that says that that we need to invest not in any specific ideas, but really in the adaptive role the research can play in changing the path of design and implementation of public policy. Not as an afterthought, not as an ex post evaluation, but as part and parcel of the way we do things, by creating those data capabilities, by experimenting with different options, by entering a path where all the decisions or a lot of the critical decisions in the evolution of any program and policy is guided by a process of research that can really shift our understanding and shift our priors.
Thank you. I really like that approach because it brings together the two dimensions of construction that social scientists like to emphasize, the fact that data are constructed, of course, epistemologically, in the sense that they encode a certain way of thinking about the world. And of course, they're also constructed technically and institutionally. Data isn't there like mushrooms in the autumn forest to be simply picked up from the ground. There is an active process of making it in order to be able to use it. And I think those are really important points for anyone interested in data to keep in mind.
Well, the last question is always about recommendations for policymakers and for the public sector. So when it comes to the new data and its better and more effective use in policymaking and decision making, what are your key recommendations? And we've been talking about this throughout the podcast, but if you could distill those pointers, could you tell us what are the most important?
Okay, so that turns out to be a little difficult to distill a few. I would say, it is important for policymakers to ask. Not everybody can specialize in data and research, but to demand that programs and policy and advice be based on good data and research should be their priority. And I say the priority because I do believe that the type of research that can help, that type of adaptive, high rigor research that can help them navigate implementation of their programs and policies is actually the next best investment. The investment that has the highest return relative to its cost. Become informed consumers, investing in sufficient understanding to ask the people that provide those services, those data and research services, the right questions, and figure out whether the advice they get is the right advice would also be in my priority list. The other is to invest in having some, however many as possible within each context and each and the constraints that they face, but to have dedicated teams that can interface and be the ones that we can work in building the internal capacities to sustain the efforts and to expand those efforts over time. I feel from our side when we work with agencies, it takes a decade for an institution to to own their data and their ability to analyze it, that we can help with dashboards and trainings and so on, but that there is a lot that needs to happen internally to align and empower the people who deal with data and research internally to translate into lessons. The face-to-face is a fundamental element. People thinking that papers will make a difference. They make a difference for like-minded people. They make a difference to other researchers, but they don't make a difference on the ground. And we're investing in the face-to-face and the institutions through which conversations happen, and linkages between what we do and what we know kind of happen, I think is a great priority. There is an opportunity. A lot more resources are available today on, digitization projects and investing in even more digital systems. Those clearly can be leveraged and linked, not just contracted out, but linked to these institutions for thinking what is most important for us to build on knowledge on, what are the opportunities to contribute to the policy-making process. So linking the ITs to the thinking is a huge opportunities moving forward.
Thank you. I think we've had a really great conversation. The time flew, and I think we've maybe not resolved anything, but we've certainly raised and addressed and given pointers towards the solutions to a whole range of really exciting questions. So thank you very much, Arianna, for spending this time with us. Thank you, Iulia, for co-hosting. I hope you enjoyed it too, as I'm sure the audience did. And I really look forward to continuing these conversations on other occasions, perhaps in other settings, and of course, to coming back to some of these issues in future podcasts for the Inclusive Policy Lab. Arianna, thank you so much again for all your insights and for giving us your time.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Iulia. This was great. I really enjoyed myself.
Thank you to both of you.